Thanks a lot for your fantastic speech. Feel comfortable.
Thank you.
Voy a pedir ahora que nos acompañen aquí para hacer unas preguntas al señor Gordon Brown, a Alejandro Dueñas, director del Área Internacional de Antena 3 Noticias, y a Arantza de Areilza, decana del IES de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales. Demos un fuerte aplauso a ambos. Todo vuestro.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
Good to see you.
Pleased to meet you.
Thank you.
Well, it's been an interesting speech. You are
I hope so.
focusing very important thing, and for us, it's a real pleasure to share a conversation, a dialogue with you. We do not have so much time, so let me introduce you Arantza de Areilza. She's the Dean of the International Relations Branch of the Instituto de Empresa, which is a top-line school business here in Spain. And I'm sure she's going to make interesting questions, so
Please.
whenever you want.
So welcome, and thank you
you.
very much for this very enlightening speech. My first question would be relating to the referendum on Scotland's independence. And what do you think this referendum has meant for the United Kingdom?
Well, you know that there's always tensions between countries that are adjacent to each other. So Scotland and England have had a historical relationship that is both cooperative and competitive. So undoubtedly, people in Scotland feel strongly Scottish, people in England feel strongly English. And the question is whether two nations can work together. It's exactly the question that you've got in Catalonia in relation to Spain. And people then ask, well, why after 300 or 400 years, when Scotland and England have been part of a union, why now in 2015? Why is there a possibility of a split? You'd think that nationalism was something that happened in the 19th century and not in the 21st century. And I think it arises from insecurity. People see this massive change happening around them. They want to bring control back home to get some grip, some control over the change that is happening. And it's the insecurity that makes people feel that there are solutions that reject Europe or reject multinational states and make them feel that they can deal with these questions more easily back home. Now, the interesting issue is Scottish people feel Scottish, but they also have a tradition of feeling British. And the question really is, and it's the same question in Spain, can you have a balance between autonomy and sharing that allows people to feel that their own sense of their Scottish identity or the Catalonia identity or anybody's identity is properly recognised while getting the benefits of sharing in what is an interdependent world? Absolute sovereignty is dead. There is no chance of a country being in control of its own affairs as a small country without cooperating with other countries. And the question is, can you fashion a relationship like that for the future? It's a problem that Belgium's facing. There's a problem in Italy. There's a problem, obviously, that you've got to face up to in Spain. It arises, in my view, from economic factors, insecurity, but it's got to be answered by finding a way that people can live with a greater degree of autonomy, but accepting that there is a benefit from sharing. If you're in an interdependent world, the idea that you just break away completely is completely out of date.
Mm-hmm. What would be your advice to the Catalan people on this issue?
That it is possible, in my view, in this world to have shared sovereignty. You can be autonomous and feel that your distinctive regional or national or local loyalties are being properly represented, while at the same time being part of a cooperative arrangement with other countries or with another country, or with the same country, you can find a new basis of living. And the problem with nationalism, of course, in Scotland is that it is emotional. People then feel that they can do it on their own. Then the English nationalists respond to the Scottish nationalists, and then it gets out of hand. Actually, when people sit down and think about it rationally, they see that it's far better to have a balance between autonomy and sharing, between independence and integration, if you like, between diversity and unity. That's the challenge of the modern world. It's the challenge for Spain in Europe, it's the challenge for Europe in the world, but it's also the challenge for Catalonia in Spain and for Scotland in Britain.
Mm-hmm. What has this referendum meant for British politics?
Well, it's fragmentation everywhere in Europe, and it's true in Spain. You've got Podemos, you've got New Centre Party, you've got the two traditional parties that are getting less support than ever before, and it's the same in Britain, where you've got nationalist parties in England, in Scotland and in Wales. You've got a Green Party, you've got the fragmentation of traditional politics. So The traditional parties get only 65% of the votes, others get 35% of the votes. In other countries, it's happening in Netherlands, it's happening in Italy, it's happening in the Northern League in Italy, it's happening even in Scandinavia. So the fragmentation of politics is one of the new features but you've got to ask yourself, how does it happen? Why has it happened? Why in 2015? After all, we're far more cosmopolitan than we used to be. We've got far more connections with the rest of the world. Young people particularly have got partners, friends, contacts in all sorts of different countries. So why, when people are aware of the world around them, is nationalism such an important force? And the reason is people feel insecure, and we have got to give people answers. You know, the 25% who are unemployed in Spain, the 50% of young people who are unemployed, they want answers. What are the prospects for them and their children? And unless we can find a way of cooperating globally to get growth, to stop protectionism and get trade, to get businesses like businesses here, to have export markets in the rest of the world, and therefore be able to create jobs. Unless we can provide answers to that, this fragmentation will continue because people will continue to feel insecure.
So do you think globalization is one of the main reasons for this insecurity people feel?
Do I think what?
Globalization?
I think globalization, the failure to manage globalization. John Kerry is Secretary of State in America. He had a report to his State Department only a few days ago. And that report said, we've got all these crises around the world. We've got everything that's happening in Iraq and Syria. We've got Ukraine. We've got problems in Burma. We've got difficult negotiations with China. But the biggest problem is that there is no system of global governance. There is no way that we have found a way. There's no progress been made in the last 5 years in developing greater cooperation across continents. So the G20 is not working. I said in my speech, there's no World Trade Agreement. There's no climate change agreement. We're trying to get one in December, but it broke down. I was there at Copenhagen when it broke down, and we tried to get a global climate change. Now, how is it when the world is more integrated that financial instability is a threat that is even greater because we don't have common rules between the different continents? We've got to do better at showing to people we can manage globalization in the interests of people.
So how can we improve these global governance?
We need, as Europe, to think more globally. I mean, for the last 5 years, all of us in Europe have been looking inwards. We've had individual crises, you know. It used to be the global problem we talked about, the global financial crisis, but it's become the Greek problem, you know, or the whatever other country, the Irish problem. So we've got to think as Europe globally. We've got to think more about global Europe and how we can influence the rest of the world to be more cooperative in its actions. The G20, which is the 20 economies, including Spain, has got to be made to work. And therefore, you see, look, if you think of it, just one example. What does China want to do? China wants its middle class and its poorer people to have the chance to consume. They need to have a consumer economy. They need to import goods that they can't make or don't make themselves from the rest of the world. What does America and Europe and Spain and Portugal here want to do? We want to export more because we cannot depend purely on domestic consumer demand. So we want to export, they want to import. How do we get a better trade relationship? And the same with India. India, to prosper, has got to import from abroad and open itself up. There's a huge export market in Asia for us in Europe, and it's true of Latin America as well, and it's going to be true of Africa. So what you need is a global deal where you bring together the big economies, the G20, Europe, America, India, China, Africa, Latin America, and you get a deal where we will open up our markets, imports from Europe into Asia, Latin America, Africa, exports from our countries to them, and therefore you have higher global growth. It could grow from 3% to 4% to 5%. The world economy should be growing at least 2 or 3% faster over the next few years than it is doing now. And that means, the IMF did a study on this, that meant 100 million people taken out of poverty because of this, 50 million more jobs if we could get a deal between the different continents. And that's really, we've been thinking too much about our internal problems, but the solution to many of our internal problems is to think globally and how we can benefit from these new opportunities. There's nothing more certain than that the global middle class is going to expand dramatically and the consumer demand is going to be there. The question is, who is going to benefit from it?
Let's get into the news. You mentioned the Greek problem.
Yeah.
Do you think the whole European Union is at risk if there is no agreement with the Greek government?
I think three or 4 years ago, if Greek had exited the euro, it would have been a contagion effect right across Europe. And I think Spain would have been affected, Portugal in particular probably affected more as a result of the crises. I think now it can be contained. I mean, Greece is 2% of the European economy. It's a very small part of the European economy. Greece remember in Greece, 80%, 75 to 80% of the population want to stay in the euro. So even if the government is threatening to leave the euro, most of the people in Greece want to stay. It's a very difficult decision for the government. Even if it disagrees with all the European policies that are being imposed upon it, it's very difficult for them to tell the Greek people who want to stay in the euro that they want to leave. You know, in Britain, people are pretty against the euro. In Germany, the Germans want the Greeks to go. In Spain, I think you went through a period where you doubted the value of the euro, although I think the opinion polls say that you prefer to stay in the euro now. But in Greek, they are clear. They cannot afford to be outside the euro. So the government, no matter how difficult the negotiations are, is really got to be very careful that it could lose power if it defaulted and then exited from the euro. So there's a big problem. Greece has got 300 billion of debt. It needs to write off a lot of it. It should have been done in 2010 at the crisis. You cannot manage debt at 175% of your national income. Spain, it's about 100%. Portugal, just over. This is 175% in an economy that's not growing, is now actually going back into recession. And so you need to do something to write off that debt. The question is on what terms the rest of the world will write off what is a huge sum of money, 100 billion of debt. And so Spain's, in Greece, the pensions are 17% of national income. That's very high. You know, people can retire, a third of people retire under 55 in Greece. And so they've got to do something about the pension system. But in my view, you've got to separate off the long-term reforms you've got to make, which Greece has got to do, and I think they could do them, but they've got to be committed to doing them from preventing the economy going back into recession. And you cannot allow another bout of austerity to put it back into recession. So the best way of doing this is to get a long-term deal about reform and change and to give them some short-term support so the economy starts growing again. And remember, unemployment's going up to 30% in Greece. It's about 26, 27%. Youth unemployment's higher than in Spain here. And you cannot continue with an economy where you've got so many people unemployed and you're not growing at all. So there's got to be a deal, but it's got to be based on getting rid of the debt, writing it off on the basis of reform, but you've got to do something so that the economy can grow in the short term.
So you hope a deal?
I hope a deal, but I think it's getting unlikely. See, one of the things about Greece is very interesting is a third of people who are in the marketplace, who are buying and selling bonds and shares and everything else, only a third think Greece will exit. But most people who are in the negotiations think it's about 60 or 70% likelihood that there's an exit. So a lot of people outside are miscalculating, I think, the chances that this can be worked through. I think there's a real danger that people make mistakes and miscalculate and think that this can be solved, and it's going to be solved, and then, just like the First World War, by accident, it all happens.
I have several uninteresting questions from the audience, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to make you some precise question. You have been talking about the future.
Yeah.
Could you make an economic forecast for us? How do you see the world, let's say, in 10 years?
The world is going to grow less fast if we don't do the things that I'm talking about, because we've got a surplus of savings at the moment. So there's a glut of savings around the world because people have been saving more in China, where they're worried about they can't meet the costs of healthcare, and so you save a lot more. So 30 to 40% of their economy is savings. And people have been rebuilding the savings in Europe and America. But you've got two things that are going to happen. The growth of the global middle class, so people will start spending as homeowners, as car owners and everything else. And you've got this pension, you've got this demographic change in Europe and America, an older population who need to take money out of the savings to pay when they retire for their keeping their income at a level that they want it to be. So we've got a glut of savings at the moment. That's going to go at some point. And that means interest rates will rise at some point. And that means inflation will be back as an issue, which is not at the moment, at some point. And the question for me is, what can you do in these next 10 years to create the conditions that you can overcome these problems? So you've got to grow faster in the next 10 years. You've got to build the infrastructure that you can do because interest rates are so low. You've got to build it for the future. And obviously you've got to invest in education and technology. But if we don't do that, then this world of opportunity now could be more difficult 10 years from now. We've got to anticipate that the problems of the mid-2020s, in Europe particularly, demographic pressure, fertility rates lower, bigger population of elderly people, and of course, huge issues of immigration going to come if we can't see Africa expand and grow. Because if people make up their mind that they're better off being poor in a rich country than even being rich in a poor country, which is what is true now, the top 10% are still poorer in a poor country than they would be if they were poor in Spain or in Europe, then we're going to have this problem that we're going to have to deal with as well. So we've got to do something about growth in Africa to prevent what could be a huge problem of greater migration in the years to come. So this is a time of opportunity. It's a time to solve our problems. It's a time to meet the challenges. And if we do that, then we're in a better position to face the next stage, which is how do you deal with this shortage of savings?
Okay.
How do you think the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, the famous TTIP, will help to improve global economy, if so?
Yeah, I think this is running into difficulties because of the vote that has taken place in the Senate and the House of Representatives. You may have seen that, that Obama is facing huge problems in getting it through in America. And see, what's happening on trade is, again, an interesting question because there's not many tariffs that are preventing you trading with another country. There's not a huge import duty from America to Europe. But what there are regulations that require you to have your goods authorized or your services approved that you have in America you want to sell to Europe, or you have in Europe that you want to sell to America. And what's really interesting is that there's a new dimension now being introduced into these debates, and these are the culture and values of different countries. So America thinks nothing about mass manufacture of chickens, and they think nothing about feeding these chickens with GM food. And so in Europe, we don't want the cruelty to chickens, and in Europe, we don't want to use GM foods. And therefore, there is a difficulty about reaching a trade agreement that would allow America to sell chicken or chicken feed or anything related to chickens into Europe when we've got a different perspective on GM food and a perspective on animal welfare. And these are increasingly going to be the issues in trade negotiations, that can you agree not just on tariffs, but can you agree on regulations that allow you to approve products in one country to be sold in another country when you've got fundamental differences of opinion on issues like that. And then you've got environmental standards, and then you've got wage standards. So China wants a free trade agreement with Europe, but people are worried about environmental standards, and they're worried about low wages and undercutting European products through paying people less. So these are increasingly going to be the issues, and I don't know if America and Europe can solve these issues. I hope they can, but then you've got America trying to get an agreement with the Pacific region, and then you've got China wanting an agreement with Europe, and so it goes on. Would it not be better to have a world trade agreement? Would it not be better that instead of having these bilateral negotiations, we went back to what we had 40 years in a row? We had a world trade agreement at each point that dealt with most of these problems and found a better way forward that was acceptable to the whole of the world, and not just sectioning ourselves off by trying to get these bilateral deals and ignoring the fact we also need a world trade deal.
What would be the barriers to achieve such a world trade agreement?
Well, I was involved in the world trade negotiations, and it is amazing. What prevented us? I mentioned the Indian trade minister, and I was talking about his attitude to China. But India could not agree to a world trade deal, and they were the blockage to it, because they wanted to be able to stop the import of food, meat, into India in competition with Indian farmers. And they said that Indian farmers were committing suicide at a record rate because they couldn't manage to make any money from their farming. And if imports of food from the rest of the world came into India at too fast a rate, and therefore they wanted to be able to stop food coming into India whenever their farmers were at risk. And that was the blockage originally to the trade deal. There was American cotton farmers who wanted the protection against cotton imports. There was Brazilian manufacture. There was Chinese problems about imports into their countries and their ability to export to other countries. But it was this Indian problem that was the barrier in 2009. But then everything moved away, and everybody then brought all their grievances onto the table, and we couldn't get a trade deal at all. So you've got to deal with these individual problems if you're going to get a world trade deal. But how is it that we are a global economy? Think of ourselves as a global economy. We have an internet that allows us to communicate instantaneously with anybody in any part of the world. And yet, for 40 years, we had a world trade deal, and now we don't. And it's the same with climate change. Why can't you get a world climate change deal when everybody knows that pollution in one country affects another country, and you can't escape it? And we're still trying to get a climate change deal.
Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. This is the first one. Your term at 10 Downing Street coincided with the beginning years of the major global economic crisis. As a leader, what did you learn from those turbulent times?
Well, one of the things I learned is that you've got to be able to work with other countries. I mean, you could not solve this global financial problem. Remember, it started in America. I went to a meeting of the Eurogroup in 2008 in September, and everybody there said, this is nothing to do with us. This is an American problem. You, the British, are stupid, or you're too close to America. They're causing the problem. And, you know, we're okay. And I said to them then, look, America had a subprime market crisis with, all these houses being sold to people who didn't even know they'd bought them. And they were buying these houses, they couldn't afford the mortgages then went bust, and then this subprime crisis emerged. But half the ownership of the subprime properties had moved to Europe. America companies had sold them to German banks and Spanish banks and so on. And so half the problem of subprime had now landed in Europe. And also the European banks were more highly leveraged. They were more difficult to manage than even the American banks that had started the crisis. And it took months before people in Europe realized that this was a crisis that they had to deal with as well. And we were too late in Europe in facing up to the enormity of the crisis, which meant it was prolonged, with the banks not being able to recapitalize themselves until it happened in Spain, I think, in 2012, whereas we'd done it in Britain in 2008 and 2009. So the first lesson I learned is you've got to have cooperation. There's a great story told about, there's another story about John Kennedy, who was the President of the United States. And remember the space race, and he was trying to beat Russia in the space race. And so he said, get a man on the moon, and said, I don't care how you do it. You be the first to get a man on the moon. And he went down to NASA, the space station, and he was talking to people there, and he was asking people what they were doing. And one of them said, what do you do? He said, I'm an engineer. The other one said, I'm an astronaut. The other one said, I'm a research scientist. The other one said, I'm the manager of the project. He came to this woman who was the cleaner, and he asked her, the cleaner, what are you doing? And she said, I'm helping put a man on the moon. And it was brilliant, because she had this idea of a common purpose, of a team effort, of a collective plan. And that's what needed to happen in the world, that we had to recognize, despite all our differences, nations that have got our own interests, France and Britain got difficulties over this, Germany and France over that. We had to recognize that we had to work together, and we had to have a common project. And that was there in 2009, and then it just went. And so we don't have that level of cooperation now. And if you hear of a G20 meeting, nobody knows where it's happening. And we don't have the global agreement. So the first thing I learned was that you had to have more teamwork, more cooperation. I think it's true of every company, by the way. We think of command and control, of managers telling the workers what to do and dictating to them. But actually, it's far more about collaboration, and it's far more about cooperation. It's far more about giving people a vision of what you want to achieve and encouraging people to follow it. And that is what I certainly learned as a leader in 2009. You had to bring people together. And I suppose the second thing is you've got to give people hope. The great leader in the modern world was Nelson Mandela. And, I was very lucky that I knew Nelson Mandela from the time almost after he came out of prison to the time he died. And I used to meet him regularly, and he was a friend of mine, and his wife, Gracious Michelle, is a friend of mine. His widow is a friend of mine. And what he did as a leader I mean, he wasn't a man who necessarily gave the greatest speeches. He wasn't a man who necessarily was a master of all the detail, but he gave people hope. And he called people in the prison that he was in South Africa together. He told me this the night before they left prison and were released. And he said to them, look, we would be entitled, as people who have been prisoners in South Africa, tortured, some of us executed, we would be entitled to go out and take retaliatory violence. We would be entitled to take recriminations. We would be entitled to revenge. But if you go out and do that, he said, there's not a hope in hell that South Africa will be anything other than bloodshed. There's not a hope in hell of a multiracial community. If we take revenge, which we're entitled to do, it's all over. There'll be no chance of a unified South Africa. And he gave people this vision. Remember what he did on rugby and everything else with a white South African team, that a black could be part of it, a vision, a hope of a multiracial society. And he had no bitterness. He gave people this hope. And I think a leader that can't project a vision of the future is not going to succeed in the modern world. And Nelson Mandela taught me that. So it wasn't so much the financial crisis, but the man who I came to know before he died, who was absolutely brilliant at being able to show that leadership is not mastery of the technical detail, although that's important. Leadership is about giving people a vision that can make them optimistic and follow your leadership to get things done.
Talking about the financial crisis, do you still think it is necessary to have a global supervising referee committee organization for the global financial institution?
Yeah. We've got a thing called the Global Financial Stability Board, which is chaired by Mark Carney, who's the governor of the Bank of England. But the problem is, when the next crisis comes, and there will be a next crisis, I'm afraid, and it will possibly happen in Asia, because the financial markets there are less stable and less well supervised, people will ask, why, when you knew things broke down in 2008 and 9, did you not do something about it? And we've got these rules for banks about capital adequacy and liquidity, and we've got a number of financial standards that require transparency. But the shadow banks, what they're called the shadow banks, are basically still outside the global supervisory system. And it's possible that either through bank lending or through over-funding of corporate endeavors in Asia, where the basis for financing them, rather like mortgages, does not exist in practice. They're not solid propositions, that things get out of control. But we have no way at the moment of dealing with that, even although what happens in Asia is bound to affect Spain, bound to affect Europe. We haven't yet developed the mechanisms that we can deal with that. So we've got to do that in the next few years.
Okay, we are running short of time, so we have time for one more question, the last one.
My last
please.
question, sir, will be, you mentioned the word hope, and I think education should give hope to people. I know you are the United Nations Special Advisor for Global Education at the moment. I know United Nations is working on different programs on people at school. And could you comment a bit the kind of programs you're working on with United Nations in that regard, and how can business people help to improve this situation and these inequalities?
There are 58 million children around the world today who are of primary school age, under 11, who are not going to go to school. 58 million. And we've got an aim that every child be at school. But because 10 million are girls who are married off at 10 or 11, they're not going to secondary school. Kids are in child labor in many countries in Africa and Asia. Child trafficking is happening in Nepal as a result of the earthquake. Kids are being sold because they're on the streets to Asia. Discrimination against girls, like Malala, the girl whose case I took up and who won the Nobel Prize. There are 58 million children who are not at school, and we cannot allow, for security reasons, but also for moral reasons, millions of children to spend their whole school years, so to speak, without ever going into a school classroom. And so we must achieve this universal goal that every child should be at school. I mentioned Nelson Mandela, and Mandela he said, my first goal, the first mountain I climbed, was to abolish apartheid. The second mountain I want to climb is to abolish child poverty and give every child the chance to realize the potential by going to school. And we held a dinner, just to finish off, for Mandela's 90th birthday in London, and it was to raise money for his foundation, which was for children. And he'd written a famous thing called A Letter to a Child, and he was optioning it to this famous audience of people. Bill Clinton was there, all the various actors from Hollywood were there, and it eventually came down to an auction to buy this Letter to a Child between Elton John and Oprah Winfrey. And they were bidding against each other. And so it was 900,000, it went as high as that, Elton John, 950,000 Oprah Winfrey, 1 million Elton John, 1.1 million Oprah Winfrey. Elton John pulled out, and Oprah Winfrey got it for 1.1 million, and then she was told she was paying in British pounds and not in dollars, as she'd expected, so it cost her 50% more. But Mandela was raising money for children's education and children's health. And, you know, we've fought apartheid, colonialism, we've tried to deal with civil rights for black people, we've tried to deal with the problems that arise in all these areas because of discrimination, but we've ignored the needs of the most marginalized children. And so business philanthropy, 6 billion goes to global health, only $500 million goes to global education. Businesses need to take more seriously global education, education in other countries. I'll just give you one example to finish. There are 500,000 Syrian refugees in a country, Lebanon, and there will soon be more young children who are Syrian children of school age in Lebanon than Lebanese children of school age. Such is the numbers in a population of 4 million to have 1 million refugees, including adults, 25% of your population. Now, we've devised a plan that you put schools on double shift, so they do morning with the Lebanese, afternoon and evening with the Syrian children. We could get 500,000 of these children to school, and you'd think that the world community would realize that this was a great thing to do. They're going to be there for 10 years at least, and get them to school. We have raised $100 million for this, but we can't raise the other 130 million we need to get every child to school. And so we need people to start being concerned that if you deny a child opportunity, they not only have no skills and they're likely to be unemployed, but they become a security problem because some of these children will undoubtedly get involved in extreme terrorist groups. So I would urge business to join what's called the Global Business Coalition for Education, which is a charity where businesses are encouraged to help develop educational opportunities and use technology and everything else to get the 58 million children who are not at school in the world to school. So we can at least become the first generation in history where every child has the right to go to school.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have no time. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much.
It's been a very
Thank you very
interesting chat. Very
Thank you very
interesting
much.
indeed.
Thank you very
Gracias,
much, sir.
Arantza.
Thank you.
I'll go this way.